Tyler, how are you doing today, sir? You doing all right?
Doing good.
Oh, good. Well, it's good to see you. It's good to see you. I hope life is treating you okay, et cetera, so forth. I've been reading some of the Theory Underground collection, so that's been nice. And then
Oh,
going
nice.
back on the general theory of Mr. Lord Keynes, trying to understand what demand is. And Mr. Alex Ebert, good to see you today, sir. So, Mr. Murphy, what you been thinking about lately? What's been going through your head?
Oh man, I've been messaging back and forth with a friend here who loves Todd McGowan's work,
Mm,
and he sent me something that a video that Zizek had on freedom versus liberty. Um, my understanding, I guess, would be, and then that got me to kind of try to dive into some of McGowan's stuff on freedom, and seems to me like what he's saying is, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, is that freedom, is we are free, but free unconsciously.
mm,
And so he, like, I don't believe in free will, but I believe in freedom. But that consciousness always, like, always comes second to unconscious freedom through the ways in which we feel compelled, or like the ways in which we, have a slip of the tongue, or whatever, a sudden outburst. um, and it's only consciousness that then comes in after the fact, and can sort of co-sign the unconscious freedom.
mm.
So yeah, I guess I've just been trying to kind of wrap my head around that, and I think I agree with that.
Mm.
I don't know. What are you guys' thoughts?
Well, that's interesting. And Mr. Luber, good to see you. Mr. Alex Ebert, it's a pleasure. And actually, this is lovely that we bring this up because we have a course coming up on parallax on Ivan Illich. And I was actually been thinking quite a bit, Alex, about your work on freak theory, because for Mr. Illich, there's no possibility of freedom without the freedom to choose limit. And in fact, the problem of the modern world is that everyone defines freedom from limit, which actually just results in this sort of pulling apart, kind of lost in possibility. And actually, what ends up happening is freedom, ironically, turns into its opposite as a kind of slavery. And it makes me think a little bit of this distinction. So, for example, when the camera is invented, you are now free in the sense of you have the added possibility of taking a picture of everything you see. Everything is a potential photograph, right? The tree, the sunset, and so on and so forth. So you say, oh, you gain freedom. And in one sense, that's true, but there's actually a problem because now you have to ask yourself the question, okay, why did I take a picture of that sunset and not the other sunset? Or why did I take a picture of these kids at the party and not the other kids? Does that mean I love the other kids more than these other kids? Do I think that this sunset is better than the other sunset? And so what ends up happening, oh, Mr. Luber has a dog. Oh my gosh, I need to get like a parrot or something. So there's this idea that when you gain the freedom, there also becomes an ethic that kind of comes with it, where if you use your freedom to do X instead of Y, then it says something about you, and you actually then are kind of like imprisoned. You find yourself at the party taking pictures nonstop because you don't want anyone to see that you are taking pictures of this, but not that. And if you're taking pictures, that means you're having a wonderful time. But if you're not taking pictures, that means you're not having a wonderful time. So you end up actually, ironically, almost being kind of captured by that increase of freedom that occurs, right? And then there's a way, what I hear what Mr. McGowan is saying is that true freedom almost is kind of breaking through all that, which might have some sort of subconscious release, some sort of like just coming forth where you're not, because other forms of freedom can actually get you kind of trapped in game theory dynamics, like we're describing of the photographs. But then, of course, the problem is a freedom that isn't constrained at all might actually just blow up the party because you start telling everyone about how much you hate being there and everyone's miserable. And maybe it's more true, but then it destroys the event of the party or something like that, right? And so what's kind of interesting is Ivan Illich is basically saying you have to somehow set limits in the modern world when you gain possibilities, so that there's not an ethic that then forces you to use those freedoms in a manner that just creates an endless anxiety. And like, I just used the picture of the camera because I think it's a good example, because people are basically going to parties now to take pictures of being at parties, right? Like, you know, because they have to commodify it. They don't want to forget it. And this quote unquote potential freedom of now you have the freedom to take more photographs, you've gained something actually then kind of consumes you, unless you can just simply limit yourself and say, I'm only going to take 50 pictures, or I'm only going to take pictures for 5 minutes. And if you can't do that, it's almost like Mr. Ebert will say in his freak theory, you just get like this kind of bland equilibrium where you're just taking pictures the whole time. There's no dynamicism between taking pictures, not taking pictures, dancing, doing this and so forth. It becomes all quite bland. So it's interesting because I think Ivan Illich is actually really a fascinating thinker that I appreciate. And I know a lot of people know, and I'll give it to Mr. Luber here. Unless you had something else to say, Mr. Murphy, because I see you're unmuted. Feel free, no pressure, of course.
Oh, sorry.
No issue at all. If actually I was hoping you would start singing to yourself and we would get to hear it. So, you know, if you want to do that, that'd be great. But let me give it to Mr. Luber and then Mr. Ebert. But Mr. Illich is quite a fascinating thinker, and I've been thinking about that. And then Bonita Roy was talking about what's the difference between relating to things like an instrument as opposed to being instrumentalized by things. So there's some different topics there that are quite lovely. But let me give it to Mr. Luber and then Mr. Ebert. Mr. Luber, please. I like your dog. Looks great.
This is Mr. Beans, and he is my roommate's girlfriend's dog, who I love watching. But yeah, I like the whole camera example. It just makes me think that when you use the word freedom, it only can mean something when it exceeds a certain limit. So like, you have a certain way of, like you're saying, going about parties, and then the camera gets put in the fold, and now there's taking pictures at parties, and there's a different freedom at a party that you can do. Where you going, buddy? And then it's funny that typically people do use limit to talk about freedom, like within the limit. Like, you have all these abilities to do things within the limit, but actually true freedom is exceeding that limit and then discovering within that exceeding limit, discovering a new limit within that horizon. So like, I think it should just be a different word for when you exceed the limit, and then you have to discover that limit within the horizon. Because in that discovery of that limit, I don't even want to use the word freedom, because you don't know where that new limit, that horizon, will be met. So when you have like your typical notion of freedom, it's like, you know, the options. You can understand all possible options, and like that is subsumed within that notion of freedom. But in this exceeding the limit and then finding this new limit, or discovering this new limit rather, you don't understand all the possibilities. You don't understand what you are walking down this path toward. You don't know. So there's a certain sense of I don't even know what the word would be, but it's just not freedom, because you don't know what you're looking at, really. You don't really understand, like, you don't understand your array of options. That's all I wanted to say, but I really like your comment, Daniel.
Well, you're beautiful. So I'll give it to Mr. Ebert. Yeah, it's just like, you know, if you don't have limits, you don't have definition, right? Like, if you don't have any boundaries, you can't define anything. And it's almost like, I guess I've just been thinking, the more and more I read Illich and kind of think him through, and then I'll give it to Mr. Ebert. You know, there's a lot of emphasis in the culture today on how to do stuff, and Mr. Ebert's talked about it, like how to gain skills, how to increase your options, how to increase your ability. It's just very interesting that you almost need to be like, how to limit yourself. You know, Mr. Ebert at the start, how to like sub-optimize yourself, and to think about education in terms of how to choose a limit. like how to choose X and give up Y, how to surrender. And it's just very interesting to think that this is like a new skill set or a new kind of education. Like really, like how do you limit yourself? Like, how do you decide when to stop taking pictures as a party, if we make that example, or not to bring a camera at all? Or how many podcasts you listen to, by what standard? You know, people are getting kind of drunk on media consumption. Like, this seems like a skill. Like, to know, you know, people say know your limits and then proceed not to explain what that means, right? You know, so it's just like, it's like know your limits becomes a form of optimization in that sense, right? And it's not really a limit if you know your limit. And then it's just very interesting. But let me give it to Mr. Ebert. I've just been thinking about how Illich is like, how like an education of how to limit yourself is fascinating. But Mr. Ebert, it's good to see you, sir. I hope you have been doing well.
Hey, I like this talk. Yeah, I'm doing all right. I have a lot going on this freedom thing. I have a little board here with everything figured out. But I like it's a good provocation, and the problem of freedom, not getting into free will, but just the idea of freedom. Okay, so here's what I have at the moment. And this is something I've actually written a little paper on this before, but this is, my thoughts have changed, like evolved on it. But they are still premised on the basic idea, which is also related to predictive mind theory, which states that consciousness doesn't occur until there's a problem. Otherwise, everything is unconscious. And we know that about knowledge acquisition. Everything about knowledge acquisition is intentioned to become, like, you haven't acquired the knowledge until it has disappeared from your consciousness, until it becomes second nature, until you can just, you know, you're no longer being inquisitive about the piece of knowledge, right? So in predictive mind theory, consciousness only, that's all unconscious or subconscious operation where you can just interact subconsciously, which is a certain kind of flow of phenomenological freedom from deliberation, right? It's an unimpeded flow of activity that you have, sort of freedom from a sort of consternation of deliberation, a freedom from the burden of decision. But then a problem arises, and suddenly, you know, it doesn't readily fit into the schematization, and suddenly you have to figure out how to accommodate this new piece of information, and all of a sudden you're consciously thinking again, how do I ride the bicycle? So there's these two types of things. So I forked freedom into unconscious and conscious, where unconscious freedom is saturated limit. So we're talking about limits, right? So let's say bicycle, I'm learning bicycle, learning. You have the limit of some quantitative threshold beyond which suddenly now you know how to ride a bicycle. It's second nature, right? And now you're free to ride a bike, right? And you've experienced the freedom of riding a bike where previously you didn't. You're just so concerned about not falling, right? You don't experience the amazing feeling of just riding a bike without thinking about riding a bike. So unconscious freedom has to do with a saturated limit where you've surpassed some threshold of information beyond which you no longer have to be so concerned over the object. And you get to experience this immediate movement, this feeling of yes, very low impedance in terms of like thought. Thought is just kind of flowing and it's not being impeded by problematics. There's no, you're not being like, wait a minute, is this right? You're not impeding the flow of subconscious operation. Then on the other fork, you have conscious freedom, which is precisely the ability to be like, wait a minute, what is riding a bike? I'm free to question the very free-flowing thing that is unconscious freedom. And so that ability, which is more of a mediated movement or pre-limit, or sort of reflecting on the saturated limits, like, yes, I'm riding a bike, but what is bike riding after all? Right? And so all of a sudden it's like, whoa, I'm critically thinking about riding a bike. I must be free of some kind of fundamentalism, which was bike riding without thinking about it. I was moving through the world without thinking, and now I have the freedom to think about not thinking. And so there's this other fork of freedom, which is basically if the unconscious or subconscious saturated limit of immediate movement is a yes, we have the other freedom, which is the mediated movement of a no, where you have high impedance to your activity as opposed to low impedance. And you're thinking about everything, and you're very critically thinking, you're like, well, they're not free because they're sheep. They're just interacting with the world without thinking about it. I think about it. I think about everything. What is an orange? I'm free to think about what is an orange. You're just eating oranges. And so we tend to think about the freedom of no as sort of like precipitating revolution, the freedom to emancipate yourself from a fundamental ideology, whereas we tend to think about the unconscious freedom as politically captured in the end. So even though you might be like, I'm riding a bike, it feels free, phenomenologically, I'm free of the burden of decision, you are also potentially like within the ideological school of bike riding. I mean, you're never questioning whatever the thing is you're doing, right? So you're free and you have an unimpeded flow. So you experience a high degree of unimpeded immediate freedom and immediate movement, but you have almost no degree of no factor or high impedance to be able to question the very freedom that you're experiencing. So it's a really complex topic, because if we bring it down to phenomenology, I would actually say that the phenomenologically free experience is almost entirely resides on the side of the saturated limit within which you are free of the burden of decision. Like the experience of riding a bike without thinking about it, falling in love and being just wacky, crazy in love and not thinking about it and being like, wait a minute, am I actually in love? What is love? It's just oxytocin after all, blah, blah, blah. I'm free to not be in love. That's not the feeling of, like the feeling of freedom. It is the political act of freedom. But ironically, the political act of freedom is not the feeling of freedom. It's sort of the opposite. It's the realization that you've been in a state of freedom, freedom from the burden of decision. And now you're reclaiming, that capacity to assert a new limit on the horizon. And by the way, just to wrap up, something I've been writing a lot about over the last couple of days is reason. And this relates to this in that, so we have these moments where we're able to say no. We have sudden self-relating negativity, as Hegel might say, where we're like, wait a minute, I'm just riding a bike without thinking about it. Let me relate to the self in a negative sense so that I can actually critically assess the state. And all of a sudden that saturated limit bursts. You're no longer within the phenomenologically sort of freedom of the release of that burden of decision. Now you're thinking about yourself. You're no longer just doing things mindlessly. And as you do that, and you describe to yourself like, oh, I'm doing this wrong, I'm not thinking about this, I'm doing that. You end up, nevertheless, always, that line of thought always ends up trending toward its own limitation, which ends up becoming its own phenomenologically saturated state of essentially fundamentalism, where you're no longer thinking about it. By fundamentalism, I simply mean those thoughts which are just interacting with the world without thinking about it. You wouldn't change your behavior if you tried, because you can't even think about what it would be to change your behavior, right? You're just fully captured by the thing. And why does everything trend toward that? Why does everything trend toward this state of inert inertia? Like everything trends toward unconscious. And then it comes back down to energy preservation, like actual laws of fucking thermodynamics, where to exist within an equilibrium that is inert and interacts mindlessly and effortlessly with your environment is obviously a more stable and energy negentropic state within which to live. And so no matter what we end up doing, and in the case of reason, we're reasoning. Why do all reasons end up or trend toward reasonlessness? I was just thinking about that the other, like the ultimate best reason for your kid is like, I go to bed. Why? Because it's late. Yeah, but why? Because I said so. Right? You end up, the ultimate reason is that reason which has no reason. Or whatever the case, like we end up trying to, even in our scientific endeavors, we seem to prefer to figure out reasons that have no reason but which are ultimately just the end point of our phenomenal, our cognitive capacity to reason beyond. Anyway, those are my thoughts on freedom. It's going to be here.
Well, thank you, Mr. Ebert. I enjoyed that very much. And Mr. Rivera, Mr. Kashir, good to see you. And it's very, very interesting. So there's a few things, and then I'll give it to Mr. Murphy and Mr. Luber. There's this funny way in which when you think a thought and you go, oh, you know, you're eating an orange, and one day you say, what is an orange? There's a kind of freedom you gain in that, right? Because now you're not just in the act of eating the orange, but then there's also a kind of slavery, because now you can't enjoy the orange. You have to think about the orange, and you think, and now you're kind of enslaved to an arrogance of thinking that you're better than other people, right? It's like, oh, those plebeians. And what's very interesting, as you know, I always like to reference Hume. Hume says there's a danger in eating the orange and never thinking about it, because then the corporations give you crappy oranges that you eat and you're never critical of and you're taken advantage of. But there's actually a danger as well if you get in the state of saying, well, what even is an orange? Because now you're better than other people and you create an arrogance, and then you start making the world in your image and likeness of what you think is better based on your thoughts. And so it's interesting because you're kind of free when you ask the question, what is an orange? But you're not actually free from freedom per se. You're not free from this state of abstraction where now you can't be part of the world. And for Hume, it's this thing where you have to get back to be part of the world. And for him, the problem is he defines modernity as now basically everyone is forced to ask the question, even if they don't want to, what is an orange? Because he talks about the spread of philosophical consciousness. And so you can't get back to this kind of prehistoric man that could just eat the orange, because now we're all basically philosophical, even if we don't want to be. And it makes me think of Miss Bonita. And you hear this in a lot of thinkers, this idea that consciousness, was it a mistake of evolution? Was like the abstraction a kind of mistake? And to me, it's kind of funny because it's almost like the jury's still out. Like if we don't learn how to have abstraction go back to riding the bike or enjoying the orange at a kind of higher, maybe a higher level, I don't know, higher could be a dangerous term, but a different quality of experience, then maybe it is a mistake to have these ideas, because you get trapped in this sort of realm where you can't ever then be part of the world. And for Benita, it'd be like treating the orange, making the world an instrument. You know, you need thought to have the skill to make life an instrument, but that very thought can abstract you from life where you lose the ability to then live it, right? So there's a risk in that. And then the question for Ivan and I think Benita and different people, what exactly are the skills to be able to go back to eating the orange from a state of one day realizing what is an orange? How do you go back to that kind of state? And do you gain something from going through this process of abstracting it to this abstract freedom and then this kind of freedom in? And I've been playing with, it's almost like one of our problems is like, we philosophically been trying to get to the thing in of itself, you know, if we use that Kantian language, as opposed to like the thing as itself, right? Like freedom in the thing as itself and being able to be part of it, not trying to get to something beyond it. And yet if we're able to clear and negate the abstract thought, that can change our quality of an experience to it. And then the last thing I'll say and give it to Tyler and Luber is I think this is politically actually very relevant. Because if, say, for example, you say, oh, the business of politics is to increase freedom, but you define freedom as the increase of abstraction or choice, then the entire school system, economy, and political apparatus is in the business of making sure that more people are having the question of what is an orange, or you're increasing their choices. But if instead freedom is found in this ability to be fully present in life, then maybe the things you teach, maybe the kind of businesses you create stimulus and incentives for, maybe all of these things would change because the concept of what freedom is politically would be different, therefore transforming the political concerns. Because right now, basically, when people think about freedom and they're voting for freedom, or they want their representatives to increase freedom, or they want more freedom at work, what ends up happening is that manifests as more choice, which just creates more abstraction. And maybe that leads to more alienation because people can't go back to enjoying the orange in of itself. So to me, what you're getting at there, Mr. Ebert, has political ramifications, because it would beg the question of, okay, if we think government needs to help with freedom, and freedom is something more than just removing limits, which can actually just lead to problems, well, then that would transform what we think is the responsibility of government, the economy, of corporations, if we have this more robust and dynamic understanding of freedom. So I appreciate what you were saying there. I'll give it to Mr. Murphy and then Mr. Luber. Mr. Murphy, please.
Okay. Yeah, I love that about choice. And I did kind of want to pop back into some messages that I just sent back and forth with a friend to try to make sure that I'm not butchering like McGowan's conception of freedom, and just to try to interject the precision into the conversation. So I started out by, this guy, sent me this video of Zizek talking about difference between freedom and liberty and stuff. And I just said to him, my understanding of freedom from a McGowan explanation is that we are free, but free in a weird, unconscious way. The way one is weirdly free and yet not when one falls in love. So freedom for these guys, if I'm understanding them correctly, is not a kind of freedom we have to say choose, like what you're talking about, between Colgate or Crest at the grocery store. Freedom is fidelity to what we cannot help but love. And then so I guess let me just also, so that was, I sent that to this guy and a few other things. And then I wanted to make sure that I wasn't just talking out of my ass. So I went and looked up more, I kind of dug around and watching some McGowan stuff. And there's a really great video. If you type in Todd McGowan and freedom, he's got a great talk. I can't remember exactly the exact name of it, but so he says, well, I'm just going to read the last line, that the most that consciousness can do in the face of our unconscious freedom is to acknowledge its priority and identify the unconscious act as an experience of the subject's desire. And so, yeah, I guess I think also that we, like, my friend messaged back and kind of was, asking like, oh God. Anyways, I'm sorry, I'm losing the thread here. The thing that I wanted to, I guess, say that is interesting to me real quick about Daniel, like what you're doing with the net, is even opening it up to the freedom of, like, not necessarily even coming into the net with a topic, but just really, at like there's a certain courage that takes to just go, Tyler, what are you thinking about today? That, like, we run from that. We don't like that typically, and we want instead some strong man, some fascistic leader to tell us what. Okay, Daniel, you be the leader who tells us what we're going to talk about today. That takes, that takes a lot of courage, and it means then that we, as the ones who are participating in this, have to be responsible for whatever it is that comes up. And so in the same way, I think, like, we have to be responsible for what we find when we say, do things like we put our foot in our mouth. And I just heard a great saying about that sometimes your foot in your mouth is the best place for it, because it's on the bottom of your foot that you find truth. And I think that freedom is similar to that. It's in the slips of our tongue. It's in our dreams. It's in the ways in which we cannot help but have found that we've fallen in love with someone, that we find freedom. So anyways.
You're getting at there is an extremely important dilemma here, and thank you for your kind words as well. because there's something like, so a quote that comes to mind that I think is relevant, because I think what Mr. McGowan is getting at is there's a way in which there's a tradition of people saying you find freedom when you're lost in something, when you come upon something and you're lost in it. And I think if you think, you know, in the quote that comes to mind, Dallas Willard has this lovely line where he says, freedom is not found in the ability to eat chocolate whenever you want. It's when you attend a concert and hear a music that's so wonderful and so grand that you can't help but stand up in your seat and applaud. Right? And I think if we think about beauty, psychedelic experience, love, and if you ask people what is freedom, and you ask, and literally, I think if you went to the average person on the street and you ask them, hey, tell me which one of these is true freedom, just use that language, you say, choosing between Snickers and Milky Way, or that experience of beauty that captivates you, or when you fell in love, where's true freedom? I think like everyone would say the second, not the choice, right? Well, that's really weird though, because the majority of our political discussions are not about the second. They're about the first. When we talk about increasing freedom or being free or being a free nation, we're not talking about a nation where you can have more encounters with beauty or more encounters of love or being conditioned to be the kind of being of whom can get lost in something. Basically, good to see you, Mr. Rivera. Thank you for stopping by. Basically, we think about freedom as increasing options, right? And yet that is, I don't think, what most people would actually identify with the deepest experiences of freedom. So there's some sort of conformity with something greater than yourself. And I think what Mr. McGowan is suggesting is that often, because we confuse this true freedom with choice, the true freedom is hiding behind the choice, and it's in the slippage then we catch a glimmer of the thing that's actually greater than ourself that we need to conform with. The way that I word Hegel putting it is that freedom is found in the choosing of determinations, choosing to accept your determinations, and thus making them necessities for your freedom. Like, for example, you didn't choose to have this body, but you can choose to use it in a manner that opens up horizons and experiences that otherwise would not occur, right? So you've chosen the determination of your body to make it something necessary for your freedom, right? Let's say you're born in a house that has a piano. You didn't choose to be born in a house with a piano, but you can choose to use the piano to then learn to play music and find the freedom that's found in music that then come to the point where it's like necessary for you to feel free, right? And so that's kind of the movement from determination to necessity. And basically for Hegel, that's the only place you find freedom really, is when you learn to harmonize or live with your determinations in a manner that make them free. And I think what Mr. McGowan is getting at is actually often we don't even know what those are though. Like we don't know what the determinations are that we need to choose to make into necessities. And sometimes paying attention to the slippage or the things we're hiding can be a way to get at that. Now, another question, and I'll give it to Mr. Luber, something I'm very interested in, and to me, this is the open question. So it's quite clear that there's a freedom in the unconscious, like the loss. You're lost in or you become unconscious. And I think the predictive mind theory makes me think in Mr. Lubert's honor of the doorknob in Heidegger. Like we don't think about a doorknob till it breaks, then we think about it. So the whole question for Heidegger is all of philosophy just broken being? That's why we're thinking about it. You know, we have to figure that out to get to what true philosophy is, because maybe all of Western philosophy has just been breaking being and thinking about something broken, as opposed to actually meditating upon what is. But what's curious to me is there's a freedom that is found, if we just use the beauty example, there's a freedom found in that where you're lost in something. Can you train yourself to have that experience in like almost by will? Or can you choose how to create the conditions that you're more likely to have that? I almost want to call it unconscious, because, you know, I like to use this move in my writing because I think it helps. To me, there's this unconscious freedom where you're free without thinking about it because it's in the subconscious, as Mr. Ebert was saying. And then there's a kind of conscious freedom, which is the freedom of choice. You're choosing between things, so you're free in that, but you're actually kind of trapped in that freedom because you can't be unconscious. The question is the following. Is there a third freedom that we could call unconscious with the UN in parentheses, which is a way of choosing a state where you can re-enter an unconsciousness and actually in that freedom find a different quality of experience of freedom that is different or akin to the freedom of unconsciousness without the parentheses, and something is gained in that parentheses? Is it a skill, basically? Can you gain a skill to create conditions of unconscious freedom with the UN in parentheses? That's actually arguably for Hume the challenge of the modern world. We can't go back to prehistoric man, before abstract reasoning, before philosophy. We can't go back to that. So we have to somehow learn to engage in an unconscious freedom, UN in parentheses, from this conscious freedom that's now spread around the world due to the philosophical consciousness. You could say the internet, you could see telecommunications. This is our challenge. And if the answer is yes, what are those skills? What do those classrooms look like? What does that politics look like? How do we go about this? Let me give it to Mr. Luber and Mr. Kashir. No one has to respond directly to that, but it's something I've been thinking about. Mr. Luber.
No, that's a great question. What is this unconscious freedom? I absolutely think there is that unconscious freedom. And to tie it back to Ebert's reason that ultimately leads to some non-reason, essentially. Well, this unconscious freedom is equivalent to this ultimate non-reason. It's and I always go there, but it's storytelling. It's the ability to pick something that doesn't have to be what it is, but it has to be something, and having the ability to essentially substitute that ultimate thing. And the unconscious with the parentheses is essentially that choice in the ultimate non-reason. It's choosing it's choosing basically that it's like paradoxical. You're choosing you're determined to choose a certain freedom, essentially. You're determined, and like that determination is by your choice, but you have to choose it, which puts you off into some journey, essentially. When the reason I don't love the terms conscious, unconscious, because like the classic Heidegger move, it does, in my mind, divide being and makes a problem out of being. And when you tell stories, you realize that all particular subjects within the story aren't actually real, insofar as they aren't what makes the story the story. Like, those subjects in the story can easily be substituted with different subjects, which still achieves it being a story. So it's the reflexive, it's like what's needed in my mind is like having this like this reflexive mindset where you are, in a certain sense, absolute. You're absolute in things being particular, insofar as they can be taken away for something else that is that particular. It's the ability to like have an empty cup and fill that cup with any type of liquid you want. Like, the liquid isn't really what matters, but the cup itself. Give me a sec just to collect my thoughts. Like, what is an orange? People can ask that question, but they're not actually hung up on the question. They're hung up in the experience. So even if everybody in the world is, implicitly philosophically trained, where when they eat something, they are automatically questioning the quality of it. To me, that's just like tipping the hat toward how much people are really, really in the experience. Like, the experiential realm is now so in your face that you can ask a question, be reflexive on it, and then jump back into the experience and just enjoy the orange. The problem is now that everybody can kind of jump back and forth in that meta position to the everyday position, where, because it's so like that jumping back and forth is so accessible to everybody, people can be manipulated. Like, people can be manipulated knowing that they're going to go back and forth from the meta to the everyday position. So people aren't aware of the movement between the meta position to the everyday position. So people are aware that they have a meta position, and people are aware that they do have a everyday position, but they're not aware of how frequently it moves. Like, it just kind of happens. Like, you could be watching a movie and people might not understand, you know, everything there is to know about a movie, but like, you could turn to somebody and be like, that was funny, right? Like if you're the only one laughing in the theater and you're looking around and no one's laughing, like, you're in the meta position. You're not actually in the movie, so to speak, but because you're in the movie so much and that you have such a visceral reaction to the movie, you kind of have to check yourself to see if that experience was like, oh my God, was that real? Was that actually funny? And looking around and getting some kind of, you know, affirmation toward that. So the problem is, in the affirmation, everybody is seeking this affirmation because they're so in the experience, and they're so in the experience insofar as they can ask a fundamental question about the experience, and in asking that question while being in the experience puts them at like a new dimension where it's like, am I onto something that's just for me? Like, it has to be objective in the sense that like other people also have to experience exactly what I'm experiencing in order for me to like verify the fact that it's an experience. Yeah, I just think that when you talk about consciousness, what happens is people don't know how to talk in terms of the experience as a whole. And when you isolate yourself in the wholeness of an experience, you're going to seek for that affirmation. You're going to seek if other people laughed during the movie because you're only concerned with your quote unquote consciousness, which is like a subset, a small part of the experience as a whole. I think courage, confidence, those are like certain words that point to you seeing the experience as a whole and not so much as like you being a particular subject in that experience. Because in order for you to have courage or confidence, you kind of have to see like the grand project, and kind of regardless of what occurs, you're just striving for that grand question mark of what is it that I'm actually experiencing, essentially. Yeah, one more thought, and then I'll pass it off. It's so with all that said, freedom isn't in any particular subject. Like, again, when making a story, it's not like who the protagonist is, how you designed the protagonist doesn't make you like this free artistic creator. It's how that protagonist is designed within the form, within the entirety of the story. So it's to like parallel that, it's like, when I think of freedom, I can't think of myself as being that which is freedom. It's always me in relation to the total unfolding in which I'm like embedded in. So it's more of a complex. It's a complex discovery to see how one is actually free in a certain situation, because that means they have to know the unfolding of the situation that they're in. They have to already know where it's kind of going. Like, that's why I don't love the terms freedom and determinism personally, because you don't ever know where, you know, a situation is going. Really, you have an idea, you have a sense of it, and based off that sense of where a situation's going, you might be free to act toward that sense, but it's not actually freedom, because again, you don't understand all the possible choices you have. You can never. So yeah, I think I'm good.
No, I've just accepted that whatever language we use ever, we're screwed. It doesn't matter. We're leaving something out. I mean, you just see that, right? And I think, this actually speaks to Hegel, because one of the problems is the words freedom and determinism were already there when you were born. They were the language. They were the rhetoric. If you did not use these terms, you could not even begin to grasp the books you were reading, because the books use freedom and determinism, right? So this is where Hegel is like, you're always already born in understanding, which is weird, because then you have to understand understanding to understand it's an error, so that you can then negate sublate into reason that sees that everything is both-sided. That's what he say. Like he would say, he would be, to your point, he'd say all these terms are one-sided, right? Because if you talk about consciousness, you leave out the world. But then there are some people who make distinctions where consciousness is always world and ego is subject, right? So which book are you reading and by what definitions? And then you lose your mind. Like you're always trapped because of language in the problem of one-sidedness. And then when you're talking about one-sidedness and trying to point to two-sidedness or the dialectic or the whole, you have to do it one word at a time, and you have to say, but by that I don't mean, and this is where, like, I like the parentheses or the dash through or the slash, where you're taking, because one of the problems you do see is someone always making another term, like another distinction, say, right, between liberty, freedom, and active freedom and negative freedom, and it kind of, and Hegel would warn you're going to end up with a spurious infinity. You're just going to keep going and going and going, because no matter how many words you make, they're always going to be one-sided. They're always going to be on the realm of understanding. So how do you create language that's more geometrical, per se, that's relating to itself in an active way? The only way I ever found to do that was like adding a parentheses or adding a dash, because when you look at unconscious, to use that example, although I understand the problems with the word conscious, the UN in parentheses make you go, oh, how does the UN relate to the consciousness? And it's always unfolding in of itself in kind of a strange way that's negating itself into a clearing to bring in new possibilities. So there's always this dilemma with language, but then I'll give it to Mr. Kashir and then Mr. Ebert. Mr. Kashir, I know you had your hand up. I'll give it to you and then Mr. Ebert. One of the things, the question is the following. You're talking about this back and forth, and I think you're getting at something very important. So the argument could be that prehistoric man, I know that's a general category, but let me, if you accept it, prehistoric man did not have the back and forth. They were just forward, okay? The question is the following. Was that individualistic in a problematic way, or was it like a blob where the tribe saw itself, blob is negative, but the tribe saw itself as all part of one, right? It seems there are different anthropological accounts for different narratives. So it seems like it could be either or, okay? With philosophical consciousness, we gain the ability to meta, go back, right? Thus separate the ego and the subject from the world. Daniel, right? When prehistoric man was either first person perspective without the word Daniel, or it was Daniel, Greg, Bob, Sue, all as kind of a clan, right? So it was kind of all a collective. With the meta, you gain the ability to break and be Daniel, but then there's a kind of risk in this because you define Daniel independent of the world, right? So David Hume would say this is where we are. We're in Daniel stage, right? And the question is the following. Can you then go back into the world, bring Daniel into the world, and now actually you have, instead of a collective, a story? Because here's the thing about a story. A story has to have an interrelating network of all the variables, but there are distinctions. But the distinctions are in harmony and service of the story. So this is what's very interesting. This would be kind of the new freedom, the unconscious freedom with the UN in parentheses. You start off as collective, then you move into the meta where you're individual, and now can you move forward into story? So what we're seeing right now is the move forward into story, to use your language, seems to require skill. And actually the modern person is in this problem where they're going back and forth because they've been introduced to the meta, and it's making them miserable, actually, because they don't know how to do that. They're pulled out of the world and they have freedom of choice, but they're not able to go into the freedom of story or the freedom of the unconscious with the UN in parentheses, or to create conditions of something they can get lost in. So then they're kind of between, I'll use Zach Stein's phrase, they're between worlds, unable to get in world, right? So this is what we may be seeing, where history is collective. And again, all language sucks. There's problems with all of these terms, but then I'll give it to Kashir and Mr. Ebert, and then Luber. Collective, individual, can we go to story? We seem trapped right here. And the question are, what are the skills to go into that kind of lost in something where you break down those problematic divides? But let me give it to Mr. Kashir and Mr. Ebert. And as a warning, I will have to go in 40 minutes. I have a business obligation at 4:30, but that's still 40 minutes away. But just so you know, alas, I must be I must leave a little more early. But let me give it to Mr. Kashir. Mr. Kashir, good to see you, sir. I hope you're well.
I am. Thank you very much. And good to be with you all too. This is a really wily little conversation we're having. Yeah, I guess I'm kind of, there's something about this moving up and down between the meta and material, or whatever that distinction is going to be, that I have a intonation that there's a way through that somehow there's a kind of, if you kind of move up and down with the right frequency or back and forth in the right way, there's a way that the two kind of give way to a third that is kind of between both of those, in which you are like, to me, this is what a evolution of consciousness would feel like. It would feel like being fully in it whilst also not being fully of it. And so I think it's about the quality of the meta as much as anything, because the trap that I kind of hear from what Luber and Daniel are saying is like, there's this bouncing out of experience into this meta level, but there's something quite mental or cognitive about the quality of that. There may also be some trauma aspect to the quality of that as well. And so I'd like to distinguish that from like a soulful meta to a mental meta, and just offer like those could feel very different. What's the experience of feeling like, I'm a soul, I'm a soul that's beyond the confines of experience, having experience, to I'm a homunculus kind of in the top of my head who's now observing my own experience. And this all taps into the kind of issue of self-consciousness that seems to come out of that, and seems to be what throws us out. Whereas I think the soulful meta would not necessarily suffer from the same conditions of self-consciousness. Yeah, so I'm contemplating that, and I'm contemplating what this kind of freely surrendered choice looks like, and also some of the stories that are resonant and drawn up for me in this from Teilhard de Chardin around the notion of a love-based evolutionary impulse which draws people together, but is only afforded through a kind of act of conscious choice. But that choice is also a kind of a surrender to the will of that impulse that draws them in a certain way, but it's not the same as just following an unconscious impulse.
No, I appreciate that. And Tyler, thank you for stopping by. It's always a pleasure to see you. So I'll give it to Mr. Ebert and then Mr. Luber. No, it's a kind of a question of like, is there a kind of movement? Another way I think about this is the freedom of the hip hop cipher, or the freedom of the jazz thing. There is a certain freedom in that is different from the freedom of choosing a Milky Way or a Zero bar, which, by the way, my grandfather always liked the Zero candy bars, and he may have been the only person I ever met who liked them, but he would always get them for Christmas and different things. I was like, oh, okay. And there's something about a kind of question of, then what I kind of go to is, if you see this sort of seemingly need for more of an ability to appreciate, and need is a dangerous word, but if we think of it, of some sort of cipher freedom, then the question becomes like, how do you spread it? What would the politics, like what does cipher politics look like? If you say, oh, okay, we're going to have a political system that's going to prioritize the possibility of people on average accessing a cipher freedom, well, what does that look like in family and work and all of these different things, the ability to have that sort of engagement with an experience, because otherwise, all politically or economically they can ever be in the business of freedom. If that's not, let's put it this way, if politics can't think that, then the limits of freedom in terms of politics And maybe economic or business structure is always going to be a freedom of choice, not a freedom of cipher. Is that okay? Is that going to create dysfunction? Is that acceptable? Maybe it's not a problem. If there's some sort of, if there's some sort of evolution of consciousness, which is very important. One of the things I was reading up on, because everyone talks about spiral dynamics, the guy who originally did spiral dynamics did not say it was a developmental model, but an evolutionary model in response to the environment. There was no guarantee that different forms of spiral dynamics was better than other forms. It was more of and it would speak to like William Ong, information technology. So I found that very, like, a lot of people conflate evolution and development, which the weird thing is the evolutions that are around today are probably, there's a chance they're more developmental because they're around today, but that doesn't mean every evolution is developmental, right? And so there's this kind of idea that you're saying, oh, what if there are these transformations of consciousness that could be occurring that are evolutionary? Well, then if they're going to be developmental, as opposed to just evolutionary, that would require thinking the politics, the economics, the business, the society, so that the evolution doesn't just turn out to be, oh, bad, or something that doesn't work with the environment. That would actually require some sort of thinking of how to make it developmental. But those are just some of the places my thoughts go. But let me give it to Mr. Ebert and then Mr. Luber. Mr. Ebert, please.
All right. So we're sitting here talking about freedom, trying to figure out what freedom is. And then what would happen, right? We would say, we found it. What's the next step? We're not going to talk about it again then. That would be a little weird. Maybe we do a little recap, but it would be pretty boring because we just figured it all out. So we're obviously expressing right here and right now the drive to arrive at inertia, at dead equilibrium. We want to kill this conversation. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to figure this out so that we can put it away, kill it, saturate, figure the thing out, and then put it away, move on. And we're exhibiting this death drive right here and right now. And this is what I mean by sort of reasoning. Reasoning always seems to want to arrive at a finality, which is itself inert. However, what we never admit is that that reason is not an ultimate reason external to our own limitations. It is simply the end of the road. It is the cul-de-sac of the mind beyond which we cannot get any further. Like, this is as far as we can figure it out. And so we assign it this sort of almost immaculate designation, where it's like, look at what we just discovered. We discovered something beyond ourselves. Those other people who had discovered the concept of freedom, we realized that was not discovery, but invention. And suddenly we assign their so-called discovery to the time and place and origination of the men and women themselves, right? So that it's no longer an immaculate concept. They did not discover the immaculate pre-existing order of freedom. We did. And so we assign, the notion of freedom again beyond ourselves. However, all it is again, the cul-de-sac of the mind, the very limitations beyond which we're incapable of thinking. And it seems that the drive of humanity, like I just think everything is death drive, or womb drive, if that's easier to think about it, or inertia drive, the drive toward the inert, which we're exhibiting here. And when we think about all of this in the context of freedom, it seems to me that freedom is the movement toward death, or the movement towards the inert, which is the least impeded. So if we're having fun right now, and even though we're problematizing everything, if we're having fun and we're very unimpeded, well, then we're very free. But if my behavior is impeded internally, I'm talking about like phenomenologically, I'm impeded, I'm not as free. And freedom is a gradient, right? There's not like I'm free or I'm not free. It's like I'm not as free as something else because I'm a little bit more impeded, because I have various things that are like, not like, and all of those, by the way, impedances are again like behavioral modification things, fears, whatever these things are that are delimiting, or I wouldn't say limiting, impeding me being able to reach my limit, which is again the cul-de-sac of the mind. They're impeding me from like getting to the end point of my cognitive capacity, or they're, to put it more fun, they're impeding me from reaching my stupid point, like my own stupidity, like getting to the point of my stupidity, the precipice of my knowing, which is where I want to bring everything. I want to bring everything to the point of their death and demise. I want everything to feel inert and back in the womb, right? That total equilibrium. And freedom seems to be the least, what, like if the choice is this is free or that's free, or whatever the least impedance is toward me killing that thing, that's freedom.
I really appreciated everything you said. I'll give it to Mr. Luber. And I like the image of killing. It's very interesting. All
By the way,
thoughts.
I should just, when I say killing, I mean making something non-dynamical.
Yes.
Like, oh, it's this, it's that, orange is that, it's orange. I just want to get to fucking orange. And that is non-dynamical. It's a single sort of inert stack, right?
Well, I think it's just a great example where seemingly, like you were saying, death drive, womb drive, orgasm, sex, you know, the three is birth, death, and sex. It's very interesting because those three seem to be the experiences where understanding can't help but unveil its incompleteness into reason. Like, why is it that the French word for orgasm is death as well? Why do people describe birth as death? Because it's almost like even if you don't know that understanding needs to transition to reason, there's a point where understanding fails to itself and kind of points to the need to pass over, like the Hegelian language, into the other term, and then it runs away. And that's why those three, I think, those are particularly useful concepts, because they seem to be almost like the ground zero where understanding has to unveil its kind of incompleteness. See you, Mr. Murphy. Good to see you. Like, it unveils its incompleteness, the inability to fully encapsulate this, and has to admit, yeah, you really can't understand sex unless you have death. Oh, I guess you need death to understand sex. Oh, I guess concepts aren't complete in themselves. Turns out all reality is like that. Sorry, whoops. And so you hit this point. So likewise, at the equilibrium, you describe that as death, and yet the death is precisely a birth, right? So it's like it forces understanding in these particular experiences to unveil their need for bothness, for the double side, for the other side. And so they're very interesting to investigate. The other thing I was going to say, what to me is very interesting, is precisely because thought thinks to die. Like, thought is trying to arrive at a point where it's finished. To me, that is why, again, I just lean towards sort of the counter-enlightenment people, because what they would say is, you cannot stay in the realm of thought forever, because if you do, you're always either A, going to be avoiding the point where it dies because you don't want the conversation to end, or you'll get to the end and then be done, right? So it has to transition into life. So for example, and then in life, there's a new dynamicism. So if we have a conversation and I go, okay, freedom of choice is not the deepest freedom, but actually this kind of freedom of experience, or cipher, I'll say cipher freedom. Well, then when I'm having friends over, or I'm having neighbors, I'm not going to try to think about how do we have 500 different types of pizza so that people feel like, oh, there's lots of different pizzas here. Instead, I'm going to be thinking about how do I offer enough options to where, one, people aren't eating something they're allergic to, or they're getting sick or whatever, but actually focus more so on creating an environment or a condition. Okay, well, I'm going to want to learn how to, say, speak with people so they're in that flow state like we're doing here, right? I can never replace the flow state with just offering more party favors or party games, more choices, but that's not actually the deepest form of freedom. So you bring that into your lived experience to transform how you condition your lived experience, and the dead idea then transitions into the concrete lived, and there it has different manifestations and different ways to do it, and now there's a skill to learn. But it goes to show you on what you're saying, Mr. Ebert, why the philosopher must take these conversations and their ideas and bring it into a kind of action that's kind of like playing an instrument. Like you're experimenting on the instrument. Oh, okay, if freedom has something to do with the cipher, how do we experiment with the party or the gathering or the conversation to create that condition? How do we figure it out? How do we make the music? And it's not just merely a adding possibility. There's a certain conditioning that occurs to make that possible. And then suddenly the dead idea finds a new life in the lived experience. And to me, that's lovely too, because it's a way for the idea to be finished but have a new life. Like it has a new life.
The idea becomes, because it reaches an equilibrium and becomes inert, it becomes an actual ground. I mean, like Hegelian, it becomes an actual ground on which you build the next. And this is what I think is brilliant about boredom. We've all been in these Zoom rooms before where there's no definite limit to the end of the conversation. And then all of a sudden at once, everyone feels like, okay, it's over, right? Like we just did it. Like you can feel it end. And there, and that's the brilliance of, like, it's not boredom, but I like using terms that are like intentionally rough. But like, you know, the thing of like a phenomenology of like, oh, of boredom. It's like, oh, we did it. That's the end of that thing. You know, and now we're better friends, or whatever the thing is, and I can't wait for next week. And now we can shut up and like drink lemonade, or whatever the ground and like watch the birds with this new, you know, equilibrium, this new sort of non-dynamical thing beyond which, and that's why I love freak theory, as you know, is because every oscillation requires an equilibrium in order for you to measure the troughs and peaks. So when you have these new equilibriums formed, you literally have a new silence, like within which to create new oscillations. So it actually really works as a mechanism to provide new ground, or if you want to think it in sort of stage theory levels, right? Which is why I actually drew some of those freak theory graphs as occupying these rising levels, like from, you know, initiate to you know, master or whatever, and then from master to, you know, whatever, like transcendent. I had a, you know, whatever the like fucking freshman, sophomore, junior, fucking that whole thing. Like there's grades to the whole thing, and we've all experienced those grades. But it's not like you lose the equilibrium that you exhausted previously. It just becomes your new foundation. Yeah.
I think that's well put. I'll give it to Mr. Lou. It's almost like you have the dynamic, the waves, then they flatten to an equilibrium, and now that's a ground. And then you do it again, and you do it again. And really, I like that because it also speaks to that Humean journey of you start with the dynamic, then you get to the end, and now you live it. Common life, concrete. By common life, I should make this clarification. You make it in your book and forget, like, common life does not mean live on a farm. That means your lived experience. It can be in a city. It can be anything, right? It's like the life you have in common with other people or your everyday life, right? And so it's very nice to think dynamic, flat, and then ground. And there is a value in calling it bored, like a kind of boredom, because then one that inspires you to keep doing it, where you're keeping the dynamic flow, because it's almost like all three of them, if you have those three levels, then if you turn it, they themselves are a wave that have their own thing, and then you redo it, and you redo it, and you redo it. And then the final point with that would be, if you require abstract reasoning or consciousness that some people are saying might be a mistake evolutionarily, well, this movement is only possible with abstraction, right? And so there's a quality of being that requires abstraction that if we learn to employ or to use would make the evolution of consciousness a development, not just an evolution. Like I said, there's a distinction between, it's a big mistake to conflate evolution and development. It might be that an evolution is a development, or it could just be a chance thing, right? Well, what's so interesting about consciousness is it almost seems like it's up to us to determine if the evolution of consciousness was a development based on how we learn to use it. And it would seem like learning to use it has something to do with dynamic, flat ground, dynamic, flat ground. And that seems to be the art of making the evolution of consciousness a development, of which then has something to say about freedom. And then that seems to be like the story. The next conversations are the theme. The story is the party. Then you thematically live it out. Then you come back. So I said that for you, Mr. Luber. So Mr. Luber, please.
No, thank you. I mean, this is really good stuff. It's so like, I guess just to bring it back to freedom, what we started with, freedom can only be achieved when you're acting in accordance to a condition that endures whatever situation you're in. Like it outlasts any given situation and it's vulnerable. It's inherent. Like, I feel like this condition that we're talking about is inherently vulnerable in that it allows other situations to seep in to that condition. So if you're operating in a way, it's like kind of obvious in a way. It's like if you're operating in a way that only meets the particular situation that you're in, then you're not free at all. You're trapped in the situation. Like, if you're operating in a condition that is living in the situation you're in, but isn't contingent on the situation that you're in, then that's freedom, because you have the ability to move through different situations. Like with the net, you have your given theme, and when we're in the net, we're living the story and it's a party, blah blah blah, and then we leave the net and we still have a certain mindset that allows us to jump back in the net, insofar as we're not trapped in the past net conversation. Like, I could talk about X today and then W next week, and like it's still within the parameters of the net. What I'm hung up about is when people are analyzing themselves in a situation, like, oh, did I say this right? Did I do this right? Like, at least for myself, I'm typically analyzing myself given a condition that's contingent off of the situation. It's never actually about some like condition that exceeds the situation that I'm in. And like, that's when like the anxiety of, oh, did I say this right? Did I say this wrong? Like, starts to like emerge. And like, it's funny. I think this ties directly to the whole like getting your kids to go to sleep. Like, you having to give some ultimate reason where it's just like, I just because I say so, go to bed. Like, back in like the primitive days in my mind, and I'm no expert, so I could totally be wrong, but people like cavemen, so to speak, weren't worried about their parents telling them go to bed because I'm telling you to. The actual environment, the actual being there, is what told them to go to bed. Like, they might know that they have to wake up and go hunting for food, and they have certain necessities that kids today, we just don't have. Like, we can manipulate and control the environment so much with our conscious that we need a reason from the environment to actually ever do anything. Like, it's just never a given. It's just never a natural given. So we have to learn to articulate being there in a way that provides these givens, or in other words, find a condition in which everyone can point to, and where you don't have to necessarily tell your kids why they need to go to bed. They just already know. Like, that's the challenge. The challenge is not only in doing that, but also this whole objectification problem, where it's like, okay, if like my household finds a condition, this condition needs to be met with every other household in order for it to be a valid condition. And that's just another problem, because it just doesn't take into account, how everyone's every day is different, and it doesn't take into account like how they address the particulars are just different in a given situation. But what's ironic is every household still needs this condition, and while at the same time has to be in harmony with other households with their own condition. That to me is what used to be the case in the primitive times. Obviously, I don't have a crystal ball. Who really knows per se? But it's that they were so intimate with being there that this condition of reason was already embedded with their intimacy of being there. And that through their desire of wanting to understand this dynamic that I'm laying out is when they started to lose the intimacy of being there, i.e. the Heideggerian destroying being, blah, 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 blah. I just think that's why storytelling right now is so important, because we have to create a dynamic where we're, again, intimate with being there. And the only way to do that is by telling a story to ourselves that our households can follow, while at the same time it being like respected by other households, because if other people don't respect what you're doing, it's going to be hard for you to respect what you're doing in a certain sense. I feel like you need that affirmation. But back in those primitive days, that affirmation was inherent, because everybody was just dealing with the intimacy of just being there. I had another thing I wanted to say. Michelle, I like your hat. I'm going to pass it off.
That was lovely. I'll give it to Mr. Ebert. And Michelle, good to see you. As we come up on the last 13 minutes, if anyone has final says, I'll quickly say, I can definitely tell you when you don't have electricity and the sun goes down, you have to go to bed. And everyone else who doesn't have electricity has to go to bed as well. And there's a kind of shared intelligibility in knowing everyone's generally going to go to bed at 7 and blah, blah, blah. When you gain electricity, you're free from the sun. You no longer have to go to bed when the sun goes down. So you gain a freedom, but you also gain a nervousness of, I go to bed at 9, my neighbor goes to bed at 10. What if he thinks I'm lazy because I could be up for another hour working? And the neighbor's like, oh, what if they think I'm irresponsible because I'm going to bed so late, right? So this kind of nervousness develops. And today, basically, this is the challenge. The third state, we're talking about this freedom, a way to look at it. In the past, you went to bed when the sun went down. Today, you don't have to go to bed when the sun goes down, which means you're free, but there's like anxiety, and you're also maybe limitless, because why not go to bed at midnight or 11, or why not at all, right? So there's an anxiety, and then you're not healthy. So you need to set a limit for yourself. And there's also a benefit in the consistency. The third state that seems to be what we need today is, yes, we are free from the sun. We can go to bed whenever we want, but we're going to go to bed at 10. And maybe you have a community where everyone says we're going to bed at 10 because that's something we share. And because we go to bed at 10, we have a certain level of interaction. But then maybe there's one neighbor that goes to bed at 11, and you learn to make space for them and not to demonize them as the weird guy, and you have openness to the other. This seems to be the challenge today. Gaining freedom and having an ability to choose a limit, and then maybe doing that limit into community so that you can create a world that then can have a shared story that gives rise to a kind of quality of freedom that didn't exist before. But let me give it to you, Mr. Luba. Did you remember what you were going to say, sir?
Yes. So it just has to do with theme. Like back in the primitive days, like everybody had that condition, which was just, I want to say, pure theme. It was pure theme in the sense that anybody can have any given condition and nobody will blink an eye toward it because it's so necessary. It's each condition is a possibility, but it's necessary that these possibilities are the condition. Where today it's like we don't find that necessity, like you're saying, like literally, like with what you're just saying. So it's just finding a necessary possibility to meet that condition, and then being able to, like, in today's world, articulate that necessary possibility. Because when you do, no one's gonna say anything. Like they're gonna be like, oh, I see. Like, or even internally or within your own house, people will be like, oh, I see. Like, crudely, that makes sense. It's like that just makes sense. Yeah, it's just storytelling is the articulation of being, insofar as it has this intimate, pure theme as the condition, like as the ground for a possible condition to be that condition that is that non-rational reason for that choice, essentially, for that given
I
choice.
think the story theme structure works very well for a lot of it. And what do we do if we have a different setting? I'll give it to Mr. Ebert and Mr. Kashir. Mr. Ebert, please.
A couple of things. Number one, if we're talking about story and creating, I think, Andrew, if I'm not mistaken, you can respond. You've contradicted yourself in the sense that freedom described as something that extends beyond the necessity of a given contingency. And yet what you're describing here is where the narrative is the complete contingency, the contingency made necessary. And I would agree with the latter because it speaks to phenomenology. I think the real problem and the reason why a lot of people try to avoid phenomenology is because it introduces precisely this problem. Are those sheeple over there? They're not free. But if you introduce phenomenology, you're fucked. You're fucked because if they are phenomenologically free, because they have no impedance, because they're totally fundamentally captured, and they don't consider the options and weigh the differences, and they're just in a state of actual immediate movement where they don't think about something. Are they not free? You're going to tell me they're not free. That's not possible. So you want to remove phenomenology and strictly introduce politics, and then you can start talking about they're not free because they don't know the content. Their mind frame can't extend beyond the given contingency. So therefore they're not free. But then, and I agree where Luber goes in the second half, but not the first half, but the second half, where it's like, if we're going to think about phenomenology, yes, we need this sort of like encompassing narrative or something which allow, and by the way, that narrative can be, I question things. That's what I do. I don't even think about questioning things. I just question everything, right? That's how and I think so little about how much I question everything. I think so little about how much I think, right? It's just natural for me. Everything's a question. Well, that's also freedom. So long as there's a low impedance to these sort of things. But I think that where this gets politically interesting, and it's for like another day, but when we start to introduce phenomenology and freedom, and we start to think about, well, these people who are clearly captured from the outside, but from the inside, they're phenomenologically free and have low cognitive impedance. And then we start talking about, and what we need is a full narrative, and it can't just be me, it's got to be my neighbor. Well, we're talking about, like, you know, a fundamentalist state. And of course, but it has to be naturally derived and just sort of like just kind of happen, you know, just a viral story that just happens, spreads, but it's got to happen. It's got to be necessary. Otherwise, it's no good. So like you start getting that mind frame, it's like, well, that's you know, that's in, you know, I mean, then you end up like the Heidegger to the Nazis. You end up in a situation where it's like, no, we need the totalized story, and if we need a little bit of push from the government to push that story, well, you know, then that's what needs to happen. But you never know. I mean, you know, I wait around for, like, you know, we thought that maybe evolution could be one of these stories. It's like, oh, science is going to introduce some indefatigable story that everyone's just going to have to adopt. You know, just they won't be forced at gunpoint. It'll just be so convincing. But then you look at, I was just doing research, like only 30% of Americans believe in evolution. So much for these things, right? Anyhow, yeah, it's a very interesting talk all around. I think freedom is one of these things that philosophers don't even really want to talk about. Free will, freedom, it's basically off limits because it's so difficult. And especially when you introduce phenomenology, it becomes almost impossible.
So I just want to respond. Please clarify if I'm not picking up on the contradiction that you picked up, because I definitely want to address what you're saying. It's not that everybody needs to follow one story, because I would say if everybody's following the same story, I would actually question if there's a story being told at all. Like, it's a story, the story that I'm talking about is a story where people can meet different understandings in, and there go see different stories in the fact that they're able to understand this story differently. So I love Lord of the Rings, and like reading that world, like and seeing that world, I can have my own unique understanding of that world and make my own story based off of that world. Like there is a ground in that world where I can realize my own story in there. It's the ability, it's like almost being it's like being a hyper individual that's like an illusion. It's not actually me being a hyper individual. It's like me just participating in something that's just real, I want to say. Yes, Lord of the Rings isn't real, but from a like thematic perspective, it's very real that I can think of different situations, different particulars that fit under the notion of Lord of the Rings. Because Lord of the Rings is just a notion getting at something that is real.
But
Like,
what about the neighbors? How do the neighbors fit into your understanding of Lord of the Rings?
that they have their own understanding of Lord of the Rings, that they have the ability to have their own, literally, like Alex has Alex's understanding of Lord of the Rings, Daniel has Daniel's, I have mine, Jacob has Jacob's, and so forth. Like, it's the ability to, I can understand how you're seeing Lord of the Rings, but I just don't see, I see it my way. But at least I can understand how you're seeing it. Like, that's the point of what Lord of the Rings can do. It's like, there's all these like lores like that people can debate. Like there's a book where what's his face wrote all these notes of Lord of the Rings, and like people are debating, like I follow these TikToks where like they debate, no, like this means that, no, this didn't happen, this happened, and it's just like a bunch of it creates an environment for debate. And it's a debate, not that I think you're wrong, it's, oh, like we're both seeing the same thing, just differently. And let's work through that difference in an effort to see what we initially saw at first.
Yeah. Can I jump on that?
Yes, please.
Yeah,
I'm not buying that.
You're not buying it?
I'm not buying it.
If I may.
Please.
This notion of a cipher political consciousness, or like creating a cipher-like space in politics, has a lasting resonance for me in this conversation. And it seems in some ways that that's what the two of you are dancing around, and you have these kind of like pseudo emergent projects of both political parties where there's this sense with kind of like a hopey changey Obama thing of like, go out into your local communities and do the thing, but the thing is kind of prescribed, and it's become more and more prescribed as everyone's trained to become an activist. I feel like there is an exciting middle's not the word. There is an exciting potential that I feel around the RFK Jr. campaign, where there's something more of that emergent quality of like, I'm going to be in a genuine back and forth dialogue with people. I don't know if it's the people. And there's going to be a kind of sense of creating the conditions of, this is my sense of what America is about. But then it's like, what are you going to do with it? In that like JFK, like, what do you want to do to serve your country kind of thing? And like, there's a way that a political leader can create that invitation in a way that I receive it, where it actually invites me to like, okay, what do I want to do? And it's like properly conditioned and contained, where it's not necessarily pointing me towards some conventional political activism or knocking on doors or anything like that. But it's inviting me into something in a way that gives me that creative juice.
No, I appreciate it. I'm going to be a terrible person and tell everyone on last I have to go, but I actually think, in my opinion, this is actually like, this is putting the finger on something like the real stuff. Not the real stuff that makes everything else sound irrelevant, but I strongly agree that basically philosophers do everything in their power to avoid phenomenology, freedom, politics, economics. Because like Mr. Lubert, for example, like when I hear Mr. Lubert, it's the idea that, okay, in the world of The Lord of the Rings, you could have millions of fan fiction stories, that the fan fiction stories can understand one another because they all take place in that world, right? And so they're different, they have different stories, and yet there's a shared intelligibility. Here's the problem. Who decides that the world everyone shares is The Lord of the Rings instead of Blade Runner, right? There's still the risk of a certain fascism or oppression, right? So we have to find, but yet at the same time, there's something compelling about the model, right? Because if people over here are in Blade Runner, people over here are in Lord of the Rings, people over here are in Akira or Christianity or whatever, well, it's hard to have a civilization. And then you just have the party and the fighting and basically no different than what exists now, right? And the dream of science was, science will be the story that everyone within science will have different stories and different fan fictions based on evolution or based on materialism, and we'll all go from there. And the argument was materialism is unique because it's not dependent on the views of the observer. This pencil is here regardless who looks at it. Yeah, that sounds nice. The problem is it is not self-evident what the pen means. You have to decide how you use it, and that's when you have to incorporate phenomenology. Crap. And I think Mr. Ebert has also put his finger on something, and this is how I would close the conversation. I know, Mr. Ebert, you've spoken before about the drunkard and the guru, how phenomenologically they're the same, right? And who are you to say that the freedom of basically the banality of evil, the kind of thoughtlessness that Hannah Arendt talked about, is really worse than the freedom that's found in the philosopher? One of the reasons I will say that I do like Hegel's absolute knowing is precisely because you get to the top to realize you're no different. Like, you just realized something that was always already the case, right? You're like, you haven't really advanced. You've just identified what was always true. So there's something that's like simultaneously seemingly very arrogant about Hegel and yet simultaneously incredibly humble about Hegel. This is the weird thing that's going on in Hegel. The way I would close it, that may be a way to think about this, is in Kierkegaard, there's this idea of the Knight of Faith. And the Knight of Faith, he's obviously talking the Christian saint or whatever, but basically he's saying, if you can tell someone's a Knight of Faith, they're not a Knight of Faith. They're like showing off and they're not really a saint. A saint is invisible, okay? Like they look like everyone else. And I think that's what Mr. Ebert is getting at. What would it look like to have a politics or a civilization that was able to create knights of faith and live with the anxiety that maybe no one here is a Knight of Faith because we can't tell the difference, and yet somehow create that opening for that invisible development, knowing that you can't say for sure that this development is even good to occur, and yet having the possibility of its occurrence. But why? Why should you even bother to do that if it doesn't matter, right? Well, because there is a difference. But what is the difference? And how do you defend that difference without creating a hierarchy or an arrogance or becoming oppressive, right? Like, isn't there some kind of difference knowing about absolute knowing than living absolute knowing without knowing about it? Isn't there a difference in sort of knowing what it is to be a human being versus and living it versus just living it? This is the question. Is something gained in the act of abstraction, even if that gain is invisible? Right? That speaks to the annihilation, the clearing, and all these other different things. That seems to be the case. But how do you go about thinking that or incubating that through politics without becoming oppressive and self-righteous? How do you have a kind of politics of an open hand, where something is available that if people want it, they can receive it from the open hand, but they're not made to feel bad for not taking it off the open hand, nor are they made to feel like they must take this gift off the open hand, if you will. How does one go about that? And how does one go about spreading the conditions of this open hand without becoming totalitarian? I think what Mr. Ebert, like the things that we're getting at for me, I call the problem of spread, the problem of scale, which to me is basically it's arguably the most difficult problem. Because you have to scale something without it being oppressive and without you thinking that that thing you're scaling is better for everyone and that they have to do it in a certain way. Well, then why are you bothering to scale anything then? Like, what exactly is even going on, right? And these this is a very tough problem, and this is a problem to think. And maybe at the end of the day, all we do is have Cypher on the porch and eat watermelon. So it's an interesting dilemma. But anyway, on that note, I'm going to be a dick and leave because I have to. But this has been fun. Thank you all for being here. I've enjoyed it a lot. So it's been a blast. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.